Simpson matter. Defendants again present before the court with his counsel, Mr. Cochran, Mr. Scheck, Mr. Blasier, people represented by Ms. Clark, Mr. Harmon, and Ms. Kahn. Jury is not present. Counsel, anything we need to take up before we proceed to Mr. Martz? Ms. Clark?
May I ask for a point of clarification?
Certainly.
When do we set the bar motions?
We're going to launch into motions today at 4 o'clock and see how far we get.
Okay, thank you.
And today we have another early ending time at 4 o'clock. So take up some motions and see if we can get some of that extraneous stuff out of the way. And tomorrow's schedule, we will not convene until 1:30 on Wednesday. Yes. Yes.
The issue that you had put on the back burner about the RFLP testing being conducted by the Department of Justice on the combined stains from the console of the Bronco.
I'm trying to recollect.
That was the one where they asked for permission to combine all the stains, then they waited for a month and a half, 2 months, and you said, I don't have to reach that issue because we don't have any results yet. I was informed that they've completed 2 probes and they might call one of them. And I'm going to get some pictures maybe back in my hotel today, and I've discussed a little bit with Mr. Harmon, but I think that we just have to schedule a time to hear that sometime before the end of the week, since we need to know what the court's ruling is going to be on whether they can introduce that, so then we can structure how these defense witnesses can testify.
All right. All right, Deputy McNair, let's have the jurors, please. And counsel will start. The court will explain that Dr. Reeder's had a medical appointment was it Philadelphia? Philadelphia, and that he'll be returned to complete cross-examination on Friday. Right. Jury panel, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Before we get started, I just needed to explain to you that Dr. Frederick Reeders, who was undergoing cross-examination by Ms. Clark at the conclusion of the day yesterday, had a medical appointment back in his hometown of Philadelphia, and he has returned back east for that purpose and will be back here on Friday morning to complete his testimony for you. So we're going to present some other witnesses to you in the interim so we can use the court time. But you should just know that we will conclude Dr. Reeder's testimony on Friday. We'll start early on that date at 8 a.m. and we'll be concluding early on Friday at 11 o'clock in the morning. All right, and Mr. Blasier, you may call your next witness.
Thank you. We call Roger Martz.
Solemnly swear that the testimony you may give in the class now pending before this court should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Please have a seat in the witness stand and state this for your first and last names for the record.
Roger M. Martz, M-A-R-T-Z.
Mr. Blasier.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, Mr. Martz.
Good morning.
Yeah, Mr. Martz, what is your occupation, sir?
I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
And do you prefer being called Agent Martz or Mr. Martz?
Mr. Martz is fine.
Mr. Martz, a special agent for the FBI, the term special agent, does that have any particular meaning?
No, it's actually just a job title.
Okay. So all agents are special agents.
With the FBI, that's correct.
Now, what is your occupation, within the FBI, what is your occupation? What do you do?
I am presently assigned as the unit chief in charge of the chemistry toxicology unit at the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C.
Could you please describe briefly your educational background?
I have a bachelor's degree of science from the University of Cincinnati in Cincinnati, Ohio. I received that in 1974. After that, I joined the FBI and received extensive training with the FBI laboratory.
Do you, so you have a bachelor in science.
That's correct.
Do you have a master's degree?
No, I do not.
Do you have a PhD degree?
No, I do not.
Do you have any advanced degree whatsoever?
No, I had taken some advanced courses, but never attained a degree.
Now, are you a member of the American Society for Mass Spectrometry?
No, I am not.
What is that?
It's just an organization that a lot of people that perform mass spectrometry belong to.
Are you a member of the Canadian Society for Mass Spectrometry?
No, I'm not.
Are you a member of the American Chemical Society?
No, I'm not.
Are you a member of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences?
No, I'm not.
Are you a member of any professional organization that has as one of its principal subjects of interest mass spectrometry?
The one that I am is the Mid-Atlantic Association of Forensic Scientists, and a lot of the work that most forensic scientists perform is mass spectrometry.
Are you an officer with that organization?
No, I'm not.
Have you published any articles on the subject of mass spectrometry or chromatography?
I guess probably beginning in the early 1980s, I published numerous articles pertaining to mass spectrometry used in forensic science.
And do you have a list of those articles?
Not with me, no.
How many articles are there that you've published?
There's probably 4 that I've published over the years, and then there's 3 that are in print right now.
So 4 that have been published up to this point in time?
That's correct.
And you started doing mass spectrometry in what year?
1975.
Now, has your entire employment history been with the FBI?
Well, since 1974,
Since college?
since I received my degree from college, yes.
And during that period of time, has it all been devoted to working with mass spectrometry?
Pretty much, after I joined the FBI, for the first 4 years, I was a chemist assigned to the FBI laboratory. When I initially joined the FBI, my aspirations were to become an agent with the FBI laboratory, or with the FBI. When I joined the FBI in 1974, I did not have the sufficient qualifications to become an agent. So I was assigned to the laboratory because I had a degree in science. After 4 years, I was qualified to at least take the test to determine whether or not I could become a special agent. I passed the test and became a special agent with the FBI in 1978. And I was assigned to the Chicago division. So for approximately 2 years, I spent investigating in the Chicago division. In 1980, I was then transferred back into the laboratory as an examiner in the FBI laboratory. For approximately the next 10 years, I was an examiner, assigned cases in the laboratory, and worked those cases. Approximately 1989, I was then promoted to the unit chief in charge of the chemistry toxicology unit, and I've held that title since then.
Mr. Martz, does the FBI work on cases for state prosecutors?
Yes, we do.
The FBI also handles federal cases for federal agencies, correct?
That's correct.
Does the FBI take defense cases from private defense attorneys?
There's exceptions to every rule, but my understanding will accept a case from any duly authorized government agency.
And that would not include defense attorneys, would it?
That would not, no.
Now, how many times have you testified as an expert in the field of toxicology?
In toxicology, I don't know specifically, but I've testified approximately 78 times in forensic chemistry, including toxicology.
Can you tell us for toxicology approximately how many times? Just give us a rough estimate.
Probably not very many, to be perfectly honest. I don't have the exact number.
Have you ever testified as an expert on the electrospray process?
I don't know that I understand that question. that's not generally what you ever testify to in court. You testify to the identification. Electrospray is used in that identification. But to the process, I don't quite follow the question.
Okay. Electrospray is one step in a particular process to analyze the presence of chemicals in a substance. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's correct.
The times that you've testified in court, how many of those times have been for the prosecution and how many have been for the defense?
I believe, if memory serves me correctly, that I've only testified for the defense on one other occasion.
So it's unusual for you to be called by the defense?
It has been, yes.
Now, you're acquainted with Dr. Frederick Wieters, who was here in court yesterday?
Yes, I am.
And are you working on or consulting with him on some other criminal cases?
There are two other cases that we are communicating on.
And do those involve devising methods for detecting the presence of poisons in body tissue or in body tissue?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, could you tell us what is EDTA?
EDTA is a preservative, in this particular case, used to preserve blood. It has many other properties. I believe about 90 million pounds, the last time that I saw reference to it was 1975, 90 million.
Two purple top EDTA blood tubes.
Yeah, those are two purple top tubes that I received in the laboratory on February the 19th, I believe.
And you provided this picture to me, did you not?
That's correct.
Now, what's your understanding as to where those purple top EDTA tubes came from?
One came from O.J. Simpson and the other from Nicole Simpson.
And the one that came from Nicole Simpson, what's your understanding as to when that was collected?
I assume it was taken at autopsy.
After death.
Right.
Now, at some point in time, were you contacted by the Los Angeles County District Attorney regarding this case? Or representatives of the prosecution in this
I
case?
was certainly contacted. I don't know exactly how it worked, whether they contacted me or they contacted me through Quantico, our research facility, but we did make contact at one point.
And about when did that occur? When was the first contact that they had with you?
With me, it's hard to say. I first did my test in February the 8th, so I certainly had contact before February the 8th.
Do you know whether you have you been following this trial at all?
You know, working, you can't follow it very closely, but news at night, you certainly see it on the news and in the newspaper.
Do you know whether when the prosecutors contacted you, it was before or after the opening statement in this case?
When was the opening statement?
In late January?
I probably didn't become involved until after that. Whether the FBI was contacted before that on the EDT, I don't know, but I don't think I was contacted before that time period.
Now, once you were contacted, were you asked to perform certain tests?
Yes.
And what did they ask you to do?
They asked us to determine whether or not we could determine whether the blood stains, the two blood stains in question, originated from purple top test tubes or test tubes that were preserved with EDTA.
Well, do you have the letter with you that describes what it is they asked you to do?
I think I do have that letter.
Do you have it handy, or do you want me to give you a copy?
Well, if you can give me a copy, that would make it a lot easier.
Excuse me? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Objection irrelevant, if I can close the court and see what I'm objecting.
All right, with the court order, please. All right, thank you, counsel. Proceed.
Mr. Martz, have you had a chance to read that paragraph?
Yes, I have.
And is that the paragraph that tells you what they want you to do?
Right.
And what does that tell you to do?
What, you want me to read it?
Well, can I put it on the Elmo?
Yeah.
Put on both pages.
Both pages. I just wanted you to only refer to the last page.
That's fine. Proceed.
Objection under 356 irrelevant.
Well, then you can do that on cross-examination, counsel. Back it out just a little, Mr. Holmes. Thank you.
Now, Agent Martz, could you read that from there?
Would like you to test these items for the presence or absence of EDTA in order to refute the possibility that the stains on the sock, item 13, could have come from the cold reference sample 59 or 72. Similarly, we would like you to test item 117 to refute the possibility that it could have come from Simpson's reference sample number 17.
Now, Actually, I'm going to show you the first page as well. Did you interpret, by the way, that request as a request to do some testing, and they wanted a particular result?
I didn't infer that, no.
Did you, when you approached the testing that you did you do it with an idea that you were trying to get one result as opposed to another result?
No.
Now, let me show you the first page of that letter. And could you read just the first sentence?
This letter is to describe the items we are sending to you in order to detect the presence or absence of EDTA and specific blood stains, which are of significance in this case.
Now, were you ever requested by the prosecution by way of this letter to try and quantify the amount of EDTA should you find it?
I didn't interpret it that way.
Mr. Martz, up to the time that you were contacted by the prosecutors in this case, had you ever worked in any manner or fashion with EDTA?
I've certainly worked with it, but I've never tried to analyze for it.
Had you ever been asked to determine whether it was present in blood or any other substance?
No.
Had you ever been ever attempted to design a test to extract EDTA from dried bloodstains?
No.
Now, is the technique that you used, that we've been talking about yesterday, well, why don't you tell us what that technique is called?
Well, the technique that I primarily used was electrospray tandem mass spectrometry.
And you used chromatography as well, didn't you?
Yes.
And what form of chromatography did you use?
I used liquid chromatography.
Are there other forms of chromatography?
The more conventional chromatography with mass spectrometry would be gas chromatography.
Now, did you hear yesterday Ms. Clark asking some questions about the effect or the relationship between electrospray and chromatography?
Yes.
Is it accurate that electrospray has nothing to do with chromatography?
Well, conventionally, you use chromatography with electrospray.
But does electrospray involved in the chromatography stage at all?
Well, it's a precursor to chromatography.
A precursor?
Right. That's the way that we do electrospray at the FBI laboratory with liquid chromatography.
That you do the electrospray before you do the chromatography?
No, the chromatography precedes the electrospray. They work in conjunction. You need, in order to do electrospray, you need a liquid. So to get the liquid, you use liquid chromatography.
But the method of chromatography, the electrospray happens after the chromatography is done, isn't that right?
That's correct.
Now, you used liquid chromatography. You indicated that gas chromatography is a more commonly used procedure.
That's correct.
And could you have done gas chromatography in this case?
Not without manipulating the chemical EDTA. EDTA will not work on the gas chromatography.
Do you know what the technique of derivatizing samples is?
Yes.
And is that the technique that you would use if you wanted to use gas chromatography?
It's a technique that could be used. I've not tried it with EDTA. I don't know how successful it is.
And would you agree that that form of chromatography is much better than the form that you used?
No, I would not agree with that.
Now, are you familiar with the method of liquid chromatography called gradient elution?
It sounds something familiar.
Have you ever used that?
Not per se.
Now, do you know whether that's a better chromatography procedure for what you were trying to do than what you did?
I wouldn't say that it was or wasn't, no.
Now, were you listening yesterday when there were questions being asked about the efficiency, if you will, of your chromatography method that you used?
Right.
And could you tell us whether your method does not effectively separate compounds by retention time?
It does not. The way that I used it is not very effective in separating compounds. I can give you an analogy. If everyone in here was to run a marathon, people would finish at different times. Very few people would finish at 2 hours. Some people may take 6 hours. Well, with the type of chromatography that I used, it would be more like a 50-yard dash. We would all run a 50-yard dash. We would all finish at about the same time.
Agent, the world's best is 2:06.
You're familiar with other methods of chromatography that work better than the one you used, aren't you?
Overruled.
My purpose in chromatography was not for identification. I did not even consider that in the identification of these compounds.
Yeah, I moved to strike that answer as non-responsive.
Overruled.
Agent Martz, are you familiar with other techniques of chromatography that would provide better information in terms of separating compounds better than the one you used?
Yes, well, and I did use a better one on the 28th, which gave great separation for EDTA.
28th of February?
Yes, that's correct.
What was the difference in the method that you used from the 22nd to the 28th?
The one did not involve mass spectrometry. I was able to use a compound which is not very friendly to the electrospray.
Now, so the first step that you tried on February 22nd is where you tested for the first time under the method that we've been talking about, the sock and the gate stains. Is that correct?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, the 19th I did a method of electrospray mass spectrometry.
All right, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That people have failed to mention so far.
Well, let's mention it. What method was that?
It was the same thing. It was electrospray mass spectrometry using LC.
But that was using what's called the negative ion mode, isn't that correct?
That is correct, which is more selective than the positive ion mode.
Did you find that that was much less sensitive than the positive ion mode?
It was less sensitive.
About how many orders of magnitude?
It was approximately 10 times less sensitive.
So it was after you used that method that was 10 times less sensitive that you used the positive ion mode that we've been talking about that's more sensitive, correct?
In this particular case, it ended up being more sensitive, yes.
You knew at the time that you did the negative ion mode, once you saw the results, that it was not a particularly sensitive test. Is that correct?
It certainly, I would agree with that. It was not that sensitive of a test.
So is it fair to say that you decided you needed to do something a little bit more sensitive?
No, that is not fair to say at all.
Okay. But you did.
I did, yes.
Now, if the method that you chose for the liquid chromatography was not particularly good, what was the purpose of doing it?
Well, I have a very expensive instrumentation that has unique capabilities. One of those is to separate out by masses. This is a tandem mass spectrometer. I can get much better separation using the mass spectrometer than I can the chromatography. And I elected to use the chromatography for the introduction of the sample to the mass spectrometer, or the first quadrupole.
Can you introduce samples directly into the mass spec?
Yes, you can.
Now, let me ask you again, was there a reason why you used the chromatography stage if you didn't really need to and it wasn't a particularly good method?
I didn't say I didn't need to in this particular case. With EDTA, it is needed in order for it to ionize. Otherwise, it would have to be derivatized. You cannot do direct injection of EDTA through solid probe, or you cannot do it through GCMS. The technique that I had available was the LCMS using electrospray.
How much time did you spend designing the method that you were going to use in this case?
That's difficult to determine. I mean, it includes 20 years' experience that I have with mass spectrometry, knowing all the things about the instruments, what's available, what will work, what won't work. It would be very difficult to put a time on how long it took to develop this procedure because it encompasses 20 years of experience or 18 years of experience with the instrumental technique. The actual hours performing the EDTA analysis was probably in the order of maybe a week would be a good estimation.
And you had never done this kind of work before with EDTA, had you?
No, I had never analyzed for EDTA in the past.
And when you were requested to do this testing for the district attorney, was it your understanding that you had to develop a method that would work?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say develop a method. The method is already developed for the identification using electrospray. All I had to do was identify a different chemical. There's no really method development.
So you spent about a week doing that?
In order to get a procedure that was sensitive enough, in order to distinguish between blood that was preserved with EDTA and blood that wasn't.
By the way, is the method that you used, any of the methods that you used, quantitative methods?
I did not specifically use these methods to quantitate the amount of EDTA present.
So the purpose of the test, the way you set it up, is it fair to say that what you were trying to do is just determine is EDTA there or isn't?
No, I was trying to determine whether or not the stain came from EDTA preserved blood.
And the method you chose was a method that would identify it but not quantify it. Is that accurate?
That would easily distinguish between whether or not it was preserved or non-preserved.
Was your method designed to determine whether it was there or not, as opposed to telling you how much was there?
No, my method was designed to determine whether or not it was preserved blood with EDTA.
Agent Martz, let me show you first chromatograms 1262A and 1262B. Do you recognize those?
Yes, I do.
What are they?
These were 50 part per million standards that I had run of EDTA on, I don't see the date here, but was this on the 22nd?
Check. I believe that was 22nd.
Okay.
And could we have slide 1257T, please? Or, I'm sorry, V. Mr. Martz,
Yes.
would you look at the chart, please, and tell me if that accurately charts the ion count that you got for 50 parts per million on 2 separate runs on February 22nd?
No, I don't believe that it does.
What's inaccurate about it?
Well, I think a more accurate representation of ion count would be the area and not the peak height.
Does your electrospray method result in ionization that wildly or fluctuates to a large extent from one test to the next?
I think it would depend on what adjective did you use?
I said wildly, but I'll say to large extremes.
It would depend on your definition of large extremes. It will fluctuate.
So, as I understand your testimony, you think that my chart is misleading because I have it based on ion counts?
Well, you have it based on the peak height and not the peak area. The
Okay.
area would be a better depiction of the ion count.
Okay. And is it misleading that way?
Well, it depends on what you're trying to prove. If you want to say that the instrument fluctuates, you wouldn't use the peak height, you'd use the peak area because it's a better representation of the total ion count.
But looking at the peak height also demonstrates that it fluctuates quite a bit, doesn't
It
it?
fluctuates quite a bit in peak height, yes.
And would it be unusual, as we have here, a 7-fold difference looking at the same thing, the same day?
It depends. From injection to an injection, it would be somewhat unusual. But at the beginning of the day versus the end of the day, it may not be that unexpected. And again, if you really want a true depiction of the fluctuation, you would want to look at the peak area, not the peak height. And the areas,
Does the peak height, in your opinion, bear any relationship to the quantity of EDTA that you're looking at?
not a very good one.
Okay. Let me show you Peoples number 541. Have you seen that chart before?
Yes, I have.
Did you make it?
Yes, I did.
We put this on yellow, please. Now, Agent Martz, this is a chart that you prepared, correct?
That's correct.
And it's a chart based on ion count, isn't it?
It's based on the peak area, as I mentioned, that you should have done.
Look on the left side of that. Can you see what the scale says?
Right.
What does it say?
Ion count, it's in peak area, which is the better way to depict the ion count.
Why is it labeled ion count if it's peak area?
It's the ion count of the peak, the whole peak.
Okay. Do you agree that if you look at area or ion peak, your method of electrospray causes, you would expect that it would cause substantial variation from one test to the next, or could? That's not unusual, is it?
It can happen.
Let me show you Defense 1259B and 1259A. Ask if you recognize those.
Yes, those are runs that I had done on my question 206.
And Q206 was what?
I believe that was the sock.
We have a slide. Agent Martz, would you look at the monitor and tell us if that appears to be not to scale, but an accurate depiction of where you got Q206 from?
That's correct.
And you actually had the sock itself?
Yes, I did.
And when you got the sock, was the green area indicated on the chart already cut out?
Yes, it was.
And you then took a cutting from the edge area of the stain?
That's correct.
Now, you were also sent another swatch inside a little aliquot tube, were you not?
That's correct.
And is that what you called Q207?
Yes.
You never ran a test on that in the positive ion mode, the mode we've been talking about, for Q207, did you?
I don't believe I did. I only ran that on the first day.
And Q207, so is it fair to say you made no estimate on Q207 as to how much blood might be on that?
By looking at it, it appeared that it was covered with blood, but how much, other than it was covered, I don't know.
Now, why didn't you test Q207, which was from the large stain, in the positive ion mode?
What? Because I had tested it on the negative ion mode.
You remember when we talked in Washington about a week and a half ago?
Yeah.
And you recall my asking you about Q207? About why you didn't test it?
I can't remember, to be perfectly honest with you.
You remember telling me that you didn't know what Q207 was?
I did mention I didn't know what Q207 was at the time, yes.
Okay. May I have a photograph marked?
Yes. I'm sorry, 1263.
1263. Mr. Martz, could you take a look at 1263 and tell me if that's a picture of Q207?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, I think that last document was 1263.
It's never marked.
No, it was marked. 'Cause I wrote it down.
Was marked on the record, yes. All right, 1263 would be the letter, 1264, the photograph of Q207, 1263. What's the date on the letter, counsel?
February 16th.
Thank you.
Q207 on the Agent Martz, is that a picture of what was sent to you, Q207?
That's correct.
And you now know that that came from the stain area that had been cut out of the sock.
Yes.
Once you found out what that was, did you ever request to have it sent back so that you could run tests, positive ion tests on that?
No.
We have 1257R. Agent Martz, is the chart that's now on the screen an accurate depiction of the two tests that you ran on Q206, the stain from the cutting from the edge of the stain.
Two of the tests that I ran, yes.
And do you agree that the peaks demonstrated on the chart were peaks that you found in your testing?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, would you agree that you detected the presence of the 293 parent ion, which is the parent ion for EDTA?
I detected the 160 ion, which came from the parent ion of 293.
Well, isn't it true that the machine is set so that it only lets through the 293 parent ion?
That's correct.
So is it accurate to say that you can conclude from that chart that you have found both the 293 parent ion and the 160 daughter ion?
That's correct.
Now, Agent Martz, would you agree that the pattern that you got on the sock Q206 is consistent with the presence of EDTA?
It certainly warrants further testing. It responded like EDTA responded, yes.
Is it consistent with the presence of EDTA?
Yes.
Let me show you 1259C. And could you tell us what that is, please?
That's the daughter ion spectrum or chromatogram that I had run for Q206.
And let's put that on the Elmo. When you run the full daughter, what is it that you're looking for?
Well, in this particular case, I'm looking for the 160 to be the base peak, the 293 to be the second largest peak, and the 132 ion to be about a third the size of the parent ion. So I'm looking for 3 ions in certain ratios.
Okay, and one of those is the 132, correct?
That's correct.
Now, you've already detected the 160 and the parent ion in this sample, have you not?
Yes, I have.
Now, what is the range that you scanned in looking for the 132 daughter ion with this chart?
In this particular experiment, I set up scanning mass 130 to mass 295.
Now, were you following the analogy that we were talking about yesterday of a TV camera panning back and forth?
Do I understand that analogy? Or?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that a fair analogy?
Sure, yes.
And would you agree that if you scan from 130 to what did you say?
295.
To 295, you're looking for a lot of things other than 132?
That's correct.
And would you agree also that under that particular method, if 132 is there, you're not going to be looking at it very much at all?
Well, it's relative. I mean, every 1.5 second, I'm looking at it for a considerable amount of time. It's all relative.
Do you know what selected reaction monitoring is?
Yes, I do.
What is that?
That's where you look for one ion coming from another ion.
And is that more sensitive than the technique you used?
It was similar to the first technique that I had used. It's certainly more sensitive than this technique that I used for the confirmation.
Now, when you were looking for the 160 daughter ion, the scans that you did were generally from what range to what range?
I generally scan on 2 masses either side, 158 to 162.
Now, is it your experience that your machine drifts that much so that you need to have that wide a range?
Oh, no, that's not the purpose for that at all.
Okay.
Every now and then you'll have what's called a dynamic mass spectrum where everything comes out and you'll get every ion. So to avoid the possibility of a misinterpretation, I scan on either side to ensure that the mass that comes out is the mass that I'm looking for. In other words, if mass 160 came out along with every other mass, I wouldn't be able to distinguish that it was the 160 only. I'm very interested in detecting 160 and no other ions, so I always scan on either side to ensure that a mistake is not made.
And would you agree that you wind up with lower peaks than if you were scanning just at 160 and it happened to be at 160 where it's supposed to be?
Yes.
So that particular method that you used, you sacrifice peak height for a little bit more range that you look at to make sure that you're not making a mistake.
Well, for specificity, you want to be correct.
Okay. And now selected reaction monitoring is where you just look at 160, right?
Right.
Now, of those three methods, the full daughter that we had on the chart, scanning a range 2 to either side of 132, or selected reaction monitoring, that is, looking just at 132, which is the least likely to find 132?
The full scan.
Now, when you decided that you wanted to determine whether the 132 was present in what you found from the blood on the back on the sock, why did you pick the method that was the least likely to find it?
Because it is the most, or the best way to positively identify a chemical. You've got to remember here, you don't want to misidentify a chemical. If I identify something, I want to identify it to the exclusion of all other chemicals. And for me to do that, I have to do this experiment.
Were you interested in finding out whether the 132 was present?
Of course I was.
And of the three methods we described, you used the one that was least likely to find that, correct?
I don't know that I agree with that. I mean, my purpose was to identify a chemical, and this is the only means that I had to identify that chemical, and that is why I selected that particular. It had nothing to do with sensitivity. This is what I need to do to identify a chemical.
When you say that's the only means you had to identify the 132 ion?
To identify EDTA.
Okay. Was that the only method you had to identify the 132 ion that you knew would be there if it was EDTA?
Could you repeat that question?
I'm not sure I can.
Was this the only method that you had to identify the 132 ion that you knew
that was
would be
it.
there?
There's many methods to identify a 132 ion. This is certainly not the only way to identify 132 ion. I agree with that.
Did you ever run a scan that looked two sides, either from 130 to 134, to try and find the 132 daughter ion?
No.
Did you ever use selected reaction monitoring to look just at the 132 to see how much might be there?
No.
Now let me show you 1260A and 1260B. Show you 1260A and 1260B. Ask if you tell us what those are.
Those were analysis that I had done from the stain from the gate, MyQ204.
And using the positive ion mode that we've been talking about, you looked for that twice.
That's correct.
As your understanding, this stain came from a blood stain found on the back gate in Nicole Brown Simpson's condominium,
That's correct.
and numbered 117.
Yes.
We have 1257T. Agent Martz, would you agree that the chart on the screen accurately portrays the two tests, the two positive ion tests that you did of the stain, the blood from the stain from the back gate?
Yes.
And would you agree that you identified peaks in those two charts?
I don't know if the words identified peaks. I found 2
You found-
peaks.
okay.
Yeah.
And by the way, the retention time on these 2 charts and the retention time on the sock charts, are they consistent also with EDTA?
Yes.
Now, would you agree that the 2 charts that are up on the screen from the gate demonstrate the presence of the 293 parent ion and the 160 daughter ion?
Yes.
Would you agree that those charts, that what you found in those charts is consistent with the presence of EDTA?
Yes.
Did you ever, in these 2 samples, look for the 132 daughter ion using a scan of 130 to 134?
No.
Did you ever, with these 2 samples, look for the daughter ion by doing selected reaction monitoring, that is, looking just at 132?
No.
Now, can we go back to the Alamo and I'd like to mark another picture?
1265. This is a photo of what, Mr. Blasier?
This photo of the sock.
Thank you.
Mark, let me show you what's been marked 1265, defense exhibit, and could you tell us what that is?
That's a picture I took of the sock when I received it in the laboratory.
And can we put this on the Alamo, please?
Yes.
Now, Agent Martz, can you look at your monitor there? Is that an accurate picture of the sock after you did your cutting?
Yes.
Now, it's a little difficult to see on the big screen, but could you direct the arrow to the part that you cut out yourself?
Down. A little bit more right there. Right there.
Now, that's what you called Q206, correct?
That's correct.
And the hole there is where Q207 came from, is that right?
Yes.
Did you examine the sock to determine the outer edge of the blood stain that had been in that area?
Yes.
And did your cutting there go past the outer edge?
Not to my knowledge.
So it's your understanding or your recollection that the blood stain came out further than the edge of your cutting?
Yes.
Now, is this what you were just describing, is the cutout on the sock that you made,
Yes,
except turned upside down?
right.
Now, did you do any testing at all to determine whether there was more blood in Q207 or less blood than there was in Q206?
No.
Is it accurate, Agent Martz, that, let's assume hypothetically, that Q207 had more blood in it than Q206? You have that in mind? Would you agree that if that stain had been made with EDTA blood, that you would likely find more of it in Q207 than Q206 if Q207 had more blood in it?
Sustain.
Well, when you're trying to detect EDTA, would you agree that the amount you're likely to detect, if it's there, is going to be dependent on how much you start with in your testing?
Yes.
And if you start with less blood that has EDTA in it, would you agree that you're likely to find, or have a lower likelihood of finding EDTA than if you had a larger quantity of blood with EDTA in it?
Well, certainly it would depend on the size we're talking about. If we're talking very small differences, you may or may not, but if we're talking large differences, then you will find differences.
Did you do any testing whatsoever to determine whether the amounts of blood in the sock, let me rephrase that. Did you do any testing to determine whether the concentration of blood in that large stain varied from the outer edge to the center?
Well, I didn't even have the center, so it would have been a difficult test to determine.
Well, you had Q207, didn't you?
Right, but that still isn't the center.
If you'd wanted to, you could have extracted the blood from Q207 and compared it to Q206, couldn't you?
I saw no reason to, but I certainly could have done it.
Is the reason that you didn't do that is because you didn't know what Q207 was?
207, I didn't know exactly what it was. That's why the first day I combined 207 and 206 and treated them as the same. Because I didn't know the origin of 207.
Now, Agent Martz, do you agree that in order for EDTA to be detected in your method, it must be water soluble?
Yes.
In other words, a compound that might have the same molecular weight and the same daughter ions as EDTA, if it wasn't water soluble, you wouldn't be able to measure it under your system.
Well, it depends too. I mean, when you're talking about parts per million, parts per billion, in literature, a lot of times they'll report things as not soluble in water, yet in reality, you can identify those in trace quantities. It would depend on the individual chemical.
But it would have to be water soluble, wouldn't it?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, when you're talking about parts per billion or million, and you're talking about a complex mixture, we have put in solution things that literature says are not soluble in water and identified them. I mean,
There are a lot of things that aren't soluble in water, too.
well, but when they say soluble in water, they're not referring to, parts per million, parts per billion generally. But
there are a lot of things that, I'm sorry.
there's a lot of things that are listed as not soluble in water that will dissolve partially in water.
Now, would you agree also that for a compound to have the characteristics of EDTA that you found, it would also have to be heat stable?
I don't know It depends on your definition of heat stable. It's,
Do you know what that term means?
well, yeah, but what heat are we talking about? Are we talking about 100 degrees, 500 degrees, 1,000 degrees? I don't I mean, that's a broad term.
Must the chemical that you're looking at, in order it to go through your system, be soluble in the specific mobile phase, that is, the liquid that you use to send it through the column?
It certainly helps.
Now, have you run tests on any other compound other than EDTA that gives you the results you got in this case for the gate and the sock, namely the retention time that you got, the presence of the parent ion, the presence of the daughter ion?
I ran no other chemicals with this testing.
Have you ever tested, in the course of your 17 years experience with mass spectrometry, any chemical that has those characteristics other than EDTA?
I don't know right offhand.
Do you know of any that you've run that have those characteristics?
I don't think that I have.
Now, you have in the, I think yesterday, been attempting to find some compounds that might look like this?
Well, I've been attempting to locate other chemicals that could possibly give similar results, yes.
Okay. And you handed me a picture of a chemical this morning.
That's correct.
Let me have this marked next.
1267. Yes.
Let me show you 1266. Is that a chart that you handed me this morning?
Yes, it is.
And what's that for?
It's a mass spectrum of a chemical.
What's it called?
Benfurulin.
Do you have any idea what it is?
I believe it's an environmental contaminant.
Do you know?
That's what I was told on the phone this morning. I don't have any other knowledge other than that.
Do you know where it's found?
Evidently in the environment.
Do you know where in the environment?
How about if you spell it for the court reporter?
Benfluralin.
Do you know where in the environment?
No.
And what's the parent ion for that compound?
335.
Now, you haven't tested that compound to see if it looks like EDTA, have you?
Today's the first time I've seen this chemical.
Okay. And the mass spec that was generated there was done with a different method from your electrospray, correct?
That's correct.
And what method was used with that mass spec?
This was the standard electron impact ionization.
Do you have any way of knowing without testing whether if you had run the same tests on that, whatever it is, that you'd get the same pattern as EDTA?
I have no way of knowing other than testing. The purpose for this chemical is it had some properties similar to EDTA in its mass spectrum, but the only way to prove whether or not it would give the same results or not would be to actually analyze the chemical.
Once you got the results that you got in this case in February, did you make any effort to find some compound other than EDTA that would account for what you found on the back gate and the socks?
No.
The testimony yesterday about the EPA documents that were presented by Ms. Clark to Dr. Reeders?
Yes, that's correct.
Let me show you People's 537. Is that the reference that you're thinking of?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, that's not an article, is it?
No.
It's a description of what, of an article.
Yes, that's correct.
And where did that article appear?
Uh, in the Veterinarian Journal, I believe.
Now, I'm sorry, which, do you know which journal?
It's Brit, so I don't know if it's the British or the Britain, but vet is evidently veterinarian, and J is obviously journal.
Did you recall yesterday Ms. Clark asking Dr. Reeders questions about that document as it relates to the maximum daily allowance of EDTA?
I don't know if it necessarily had to do with maximum daily allowance or what you would expect to find in a person. I think it was more relating to how much you would expect to find in a person's blood.
Does that abstract indicate that you would expect to find 2,000 parts per million in anybody's blood?
No.
And
It states that it should not exceed 2,000 parts per million.
what's the concentration of EDTA in a purple top tube?
Somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 parts per million.
Would you agree that if someone had 2,000 parts per million EDTA in their blood, they'd be dead?
Well, for any sustained period of time, I think they use it also for transfusions. I don't know the exact amount that they use. It would not be a good idea, I don't think, to have that amount in your blood. I agree with that.
Does that number bear any relationship at all to what the FDA allows in terms of EDTA as a food additive?
No, no, I don't believe it does.
Is your understanding that particular study was a study on fish?
That's correct.
And it was to determine the toxic level that would kill fish?
No, I did some further research, and actually the whole reference has to do with how much EDTA is used to preserve blood. It has absolutely nothing to do whatsoever with how much you would expect to find in fish or humans. It was completely out of context.
Okay. Now, I want to ask you about EDTA that you might expect in your blood from food. And you provided us several articles that you found related to that topic, have you not?
Right.
Let me show you an article. We have this marked. I'm sorry, 1260. $1267. Okay. Let me show you 1267. You recall Ms. Clark yesterday mentioning the figures of 50 milligrams per day as a possible amount of EDTA that someone might take into their system.
Yes, that's correct.
And is that the article that came from?
Yes.
Why don't you just give us the name of that article?
It's the Food Iron Absorption in Man, the Effects of EDTA on Absorption of Dietary Non-Heme Iron.
Now, you also were shown yesterday some excerpts from the Code of Federal Regulations. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Could we, I don't have the exhibit number on this one, Your Honor. 539. Take a look at that again. Is that the document that describes what the FDA says is the allowable maximum amounts of EDTA in food preservatives or food substances?
That's correct.
And I'd like to put that on the yellow again. Now, this is a document that you provided to us as well, is it not?
That's correct.
Now, is your understanding that the 50 milligram per day figure that is in that article that you provided to us was based on what the FDA says are the maximum levels of EDTA you can put in food?
I'd say that had most of the basis for it, yes.
Now, could we move that up just a little bit, Mr. Harris? Now, this regulation talks about parts per million, 220 parts per million, 33 parts per million. That bears no relationship to parts per million in blood, does it?
No.
That's what you can put in the food
Yes.
that then gets eaten and
Right.
greatly diluted.
Yes. Yes.
Now, you also provided us a study from 1954 concerning the metabolism of EDTA in humans, correct?
I don't think it primarily dealt with metabolism. It was an article about EDTA being injected in humans.
Okay.
I think they did mention it was not metabolized, but I don't think that was the purpose of the article.
Okay, but this was an article that you provided to us.
Right, yes.
And an article that you relied upon in forming your opinions in this case?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay. It's an article that you reviewed and we've discussed, haven't
It's
we?
an article. I reviewed many articles on EDTA. That was one of them.
Now, what is your understanding as to the body of literature on EDTA, such as it is, in terms of how much EDTA that you eat in food actually gets into your blood?
It's unclear. The best is that paper there from 1954, but even in that paper it mentions some data which is conflicting. And there hasn't been a whole lot of data since then. Most of the other papers, even today, refer back to that paper in 1954. I believe that it's not well known.
Well, what does this paper say?
In that one, the absorption,
Yes.
it says 5% is absorbed.
And there's other literature that says that as well, correct?
Well, I think all the other literature is based on that, to my knowledge.
Well,
There's no other independent study that I could find.
what is you provided us some other literature that says the same thing, didn't you?
Yes, yes. I mean, it was mentioned in a lot of articles that was the absorption. I agree with that.
Did you provide us with some excerpts from a textbook called The Pharmacological Basis of Therapeutics by Goodman and Gilmans?
Yes.
And is that an accepted text in the field of pharmacology?
Yes.
And what does that indicate in terms of the absorption of EDTA that you take in by mouth into the blood?
I assume it says 5%.
Okay. Now, would you like to look at that to
No,
confirm it?
I'm sure it says 5%.
Now, when we talk about absorption into the blood, when you eat something, it doesn't just go into the blood, does it?
No, no.
What happens to it in the stomach in terms of how it gets to the blood versus how it gets excreted in other ways?
Well, we're trailing a little bit out of my field, but certainly in order to survive, things have to be absorbed into the bloodstream. If you eat everything and nothing gets absorbed, you're going to die.
Now, the 54 study indicates that the vast majority, 90% or more of the EDTA that you might eat gets excreted through the feces and never gets to the blood, correct?
That's what that one paper showed, yes.
And when we talk about a 5% absorption rate, we're talking about of the, let's say, the 50 milligrams that a person might eat in a day, only 5% of that actually gets into the blood at some point.
Yeah, approximately 2.5 milligrams, according to that paper.
Now, that paper also talks about when it gets into the bloodstream, that it also gets into other extracellular fluid, in other words, other fluid in the body, correct?
Right, correct.
And the total volume, approximately, of this other fluid in the body is what?
I think the paper there may have used 40 liters. It would depend, of course, on the size of the individual, so that would be probably an average.
Now, would you agree that it's a relatively easy calculation to figure out if you had 2.5 milligrams in 40 liters, how many parts per million, billion, or whatever that is?
Right, yeah.
And what is that figure,
I believe, was it 60 parts per billion?
approximately?
Approximately 60 parts per billion.
We're talking in the range of parts per billion rather than parts per million, correct?
According to that study, yes.
Now, under that set of conditions that I just described to you, that assumes, does it not, that whatever gets absorbed into the blood is all there at the time that you take the measurement.
That's
Correct.
correct.
Now, what does the literature indicate in terms of how quickly EDTA that does get into the bloodstream gets out of the bloodstream?
Well, its half-life is very short. It leaves the bloodstream very quickly, according to that paper.
And are we talking in terms of minutes or hours?
I think it was hours.
Would you like to look at that article to refresh your memory? One hour is.
Okay. So the half-life would be an hour.
And by half-life, does that mean that once this, let's say 60 parts per billion gets into your system, 1 hour later, there's only going to be half as much?
That's correct.
And 1 hour after that, there's going to be half again as much?
Yes,
So that it's quickly, very quickly eliminated from the system.
that's correct. That's according to that paper in 1954.
Now, would you agree that under those circumstances that we've described, that's consistent with the literature, that the amount of EDTA that you might expect to find in a person's blood after they ate something with EDTA in it is likely to be very, very small in the range of parts per billion?
Well, I think if you take everything into account, it'd be difficult to say that. I mean, you're looking at one study in 1954, and it mentions at the end of that there's some conflicting data based on iron and yttrium being eliminated very quickly from the body when it's ingested, when EDTA is ingested. And that paper only mentions one of the salts that the FDA permits to be used in the food. There's two other salts. So relying totally on one paper in 1954 with a lot of other conflicting information and information that's not available, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't believe that anyone knows exactly how much EDTA is present.
Well, when you say a lot of conflicting information, what conflicting information are you talking about?
Well, conflicting information with iron studies, the fact that it indicates that more is absorbed than the 5%.
What paper says that?
This particular paper here, the last
ha-
paragraph.
you have that in front of
Second
you?
last paragraph.
You have that in front
No,
of you?
you took it back from me, I think.
I did. Is that what you're referring to?
Right, yes, exactly. Would you like me to read it?
Let me put on the Elmo, then you can
Okay.
read it. Perhaps you should mark this.
1268.
1268.
1268, and we'll wind it up at this point.
I'm sorry?
Wind it up.
Now, the paragraph you're referring to is the one that has the little asterisk in front of it, correct?
That's correct.
And why don't you read that to us?
The low absorption after oral administration is very surprising in view of the findings that material
Mr. Martz, beginning the last one, I can't.
The low absorption after oral administration is very surprising in view of the finding that the material is effective by that route in accelerating the excretion of yttrium and lead. There is no satisfactory, readily apparent explanation at the present time, or at this present time.
Now, would you agree that what that says is that EDTA is able to help remove yttrium and lead from the blood very quickly?
That's, well, yes.
Okay? And that's another indication. Is that a fair characterization, what I just said?
Well, I don't agree with you 100% on that.
Okay, but there's no data there, is there?
No.
And that doesn't say that EDTA is absorbed more than 5% in the blood, does it?
Well, it kind of implies that to me.
Well, it doesn't say that, does it?
It doesn't say that.
What it says is it's very effective at getting things out of the blood quickly.
And the only way to get something out of the blood is to get in the blood, first of all.
Okay. And then get out of it quickly.
Right, because it's a chelating agent. Once it gets in the blood, it chelates, or gets in the body, and then it will go and be excreted.
Okay.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our mid-morning recess at this time. Please remember all my admonitions to you. We'll be in recess for 15 minutes, and Agent Martz, you can sit down or go back to 15 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Agent Martz, at the break, did I ask you to take a look at those two 50 parts per million charts to compare the areas,
Yes,
as you indicated?
right, that's correct.
And what's the difference in the areas of the two 50 parts per million charts that you ran on the 22nd?
It's about a fourfold difference.
Okay. And you agree that the 50 parts per million, you knew that that's exactly what it was because you had prepared known EDTA in that concentration to put in your machine.
That's correct.
And when you put it through the second time and got a fourfold difference in your area output, it was still the same 50 parts per million.
Yes.
Now, would you agree that the substance that you found that had the consistent retention time, the parent ion and the daughter ion, that in your opinion the quantities that you found are in the parts per million range?
That would be the most, yes.
Okay. Which is, correct me if I'm wrong, 1,000 times more than the parts per billion range.
That's correct.
Now, I want to ask you some questions about the technique that you used at the beginning of your testing. You have that in mind?
Yes.
When you got the stains in this case, when you got Q206 and Q207, actually you assigned those numbers, didn't you?
Well, they were actually signed by Special Agent Doug Diedrich.
Okay, but I mean that's an FBI number, not an LAPD number.
Right, that's correct.
When you got those samples, did I hear you say this morning that you mixed those two together for your first series of tests?
Yes, that's correct.
And you did not know what Q207 was?
Well, I knew it was from the sock, and obviously it was blood stained, but I didn't specifically know that it was cut out of that area. I mean, it was logical to assume that, but I didn't know that for a fact.
So you, as part of the first steps of your test, combined two unknown samples, the source of which you didn't know?
Well, I knew they were both from the sock, and I knew they were both blood stains from the sock. And my object was to determine whether or not there was EDTA present on the sock. So I combined the two to see whether or not EDTA was present on either of those particular cuttings. And I took that into account by using twice as much of that particular sample as I did from the control that I prepared.
So you used twice as much in that run, and that was using the negative ion mode that we talked about a little bit this morning,
That's correct.
the less sensitive testing?
The one that's much more specific, in this particular case, it was less sensitive. But you got to remember here, it had a lot more specificity, and that's why I used it to begin with. Negative ion mass spec is a very sensitive technique. And in order to identify the EDTA present, it has to react with iron. EDTA is a chelating agent. So I wanted to use a very specific test, and that's why I chose that test on that day, because I not only had to have a compound with a particular molecular weight, it had to react with iron in order to give these results. And the only ones that gave results on that particular day were the controls that I prepared.
Now, but you determined yourself by your own experimentation that that was 1/10 as sensitive as the positive ion mode that we've been talking about.
It had less sensitivity, but sensitivity was not my problem. What I was asked to do was determine whether or not the stains were EDTA preserved or not preserved. I was able to answer that question in the negative ion mode very easily. These stains were not from preserved blood.
Well, we'll talk about that. But when you ran the positive ion mode the next day, the test that will detect the ions more sensitively than the one you did the day before. Will you agree with that?
It was more sensitive, but sensitivity was not an issue. Specificity was my issue. I wanted to determine whether or not EDTA was present, and if it was, I wanted to make sure I could identify it. And as I mentioned, it was not present.
So you weren't concerned with whether it was there or not when you did the negative ion mode?
No, I was asked to determine whether or not EDTA was present, and it was very easy to do in the negative ion mode. I was able to determine on the first day that EDTA was not present on those particular stains, and those stains did not come from preserved blood.
Were you able to determine with a negative ion mode that there wasn't EDTA on those stains?
There was not EDTA present in the amount that you would find in preserved blood. I proved that on the first day.
Agent Martz, please listen to my question. Were you able to determine with a negative ion mode that there was no EDTA on those stains?
I was not able to identify any EDTA on those stains.
Were you able to rule out the possibility that there was EDTA on those stains with your negative ion mode?
Yes, in my opinion, EDTA was not present on those stains.
All right, when you did your testing the next day with a positive ion mode and found what looks like EDTA, where do you think it came from?
Well, you got to remember here, everyone's saying that I found EDTA. I've never said that, and I don't believe Dr. Reeder's ever said that. There was indication that EDTA could have been present. There's a lot of other explanations for the ions that I got on the first day. I am not convinced that EDTA is present on that sock, and I want to make that perfectly clear. There are many possibilities for those ion counts that I got. One is it could be from another compound that had similar results. That's why I performed the daughter ion experiment, to determine whether or not EDTA was present. I was convinced that EDTA was not present in those samples.
So you had made up your mind as to what you were going to find before you did the test?
That is not correct.
Okay.
I was asked to determine whether or not those blood stains came from preserved blood. And those blood stains did not come from preserved blood. I was able to prove that on the first day.
What you saw in that blood stain, in both blood stains, the second day, you didn't see the first day, did you?
No, it's a completely different technique. As I mentioned, in the negative ion mode, the EDTA must react with iron.
Agent Martz?
The second day when I ran the test, all I was looking for was a 293 ion and a 162. Iron was not a factor. So the
Next question.
possibility
Hold on.
exists.
Agent?
Hold on, next question.
Did you add anything to the samples from day 1 to day 2?
Yes.
Did you add EDTA?
No, I added water.
Does water give you a pattern like EDTA?
As I told you, I did not identify EDTA in any of the samples on any day.
All right, let's talk in terms of the 293 parent ion, which EDTA has, and the 160 daughter ion, which EDTA has. You have that in mind?
Yes.
Did you add anything that had a parent ion of 293 and a daughter ion of 160 between day 1 and day 2?
Well, I mean, I don't quite understand that question. Of course I didn't, but the fact of the matter is on the first day I didn't even look for those ions.
All right, move to strike everything except, of course, I didn't.
Sustained, answer stricken as being non-responsive.
Now, are you saying that that 293 parent ion and the 160 daughter ion weren't there the first day?
I didn't look for them the first day.
Then you don't know whether they were there or not, do you?
Well, it's difficult to determine if I didn't look for them.
Second day you found them, didn't you?
The second day,
Sustain, rephrase the question.
Did you find them the second day?
I detected both ion 162 and 293 on the second day because the experiment I performed looked for those various ions.
Now let me ask you this. Is your reason for saying that what you found, even though it has consistent retention time, consistent parent ion, consistent daughter ion, that the reason you're unwilling to say that that's EDTA is because you couldn't find the 132 daughter ion?
No, I didn't say that at all. The reason I'm saying that it's not EDTA is several-fold. I conducted many experiments over several days. The first day I looked for EDTA in the negative ion mode. It was not present. On another day, the 28th, I looked for EDTA on another test in HPLC, which was completely different testing than any of the other days. And EDTA was not present on the sock or on the gate. So I have two tests that show no EDTA is present. I have another test on another day which has ions that are similar or the same as EDTA. In order for me to identify EDTA, I have to have what's called a full daughter spectrum. When you just look at several ions, you can make mistakes. Those mistakes have been made, and because mistakes like that have been made, procedures have been changed. In order for me to positively identify a chemical to the exclusion of all others, I need to have a full daughter spectrum. And in order to do that, I have to set the scan, the instrument, the way that I did. I was not able to identify EDTA in those particular stains.
Agent Martz, you agree that you did detect at the appropriate retention time the 293 parent ion, the 160 daughter ion on day 2.
Well, you're making a great deal of the retention time. The
Honor, move to strike.
Sustain.
You found that, didn't you? The 293, the 160 at the appropriate retention time.
That's correct.
Have you identified anything other than EDTA?
And that assumes that's not an evidence contrary to testimony that it is
Oral.
an appropriate retention time.
Oral.
Have you determined any compound, have you located or identified any compound other than EDTA that accounts for your findings?
I was just faxed another copy of another chromatogram that could possibly give similar results that I just got several minutes ago.
Okay. Do you know what that is?
Yes, I can get it for you if you'd like.
What is it?
It's a steroid-type chemical. It's right there.
And what method was used to perform this chromatography or mass spec?
Well, that particular chromatography was probably gas chromatography, and the mass spec type was electron impact.
So that's a different method also, isn't it?
Well, but you...
Agent Martz, is that a different method?
Well, no, because mass spectrometry is a technique that I used for the identification, and that is mass spectrometry. And you can make certain assumptions in mass spectrometry when you're dealing with ions. We're dealing with 2 ions here. That is not very many. This particular compound and many other compounds will have those 2 ions.
When you found what you did find, whether it's EDTA or something that just looks like EDTA, did you advise the prosecution of what you had found?
I had prepared a report, yes.
And by the way, in your report, well, let me rephrase that. How soon after you got the charts that we've seen here with the peaks at the appropriate times, parent and daughter ion, did you tell the prosecution that you had found that?
Oral.
I believe it was sometime at the end of February, early March. I don't have the exact date.
Did they ever ask you to try and find what that might be other than EDTA?
No. I mean, it was not necessary because I had already answered the question, the fact that those stains did not come from preserved blood. There was no reason to try to determine what those ions came from.
But from February until this morning or last night, you haven't tried to find a compound that explains your findings, have you?
Well, I have because I believe that my data has been misinterpreted by somebody else, and I wanted to prove that.
I want to ask you some questions about your, incidentally, you said that you used twice as much on day one of the Q206, Q207 mixture than you used the next day?
That's correct.
So you used half as much sample when you used the more sensitive test?
Well, in every case that I did this,
Yeah, move to strike is non-responsive.
Sustain.
You used half as much with the more sensitive test.
I used half as much of the 206 versus 207 on the 22nd as I did on the 19th.
Would you agree that if there had been EDTA in your mixture of Q206 and Q207, there'd be 1/2 as much in the test that you ran the next day, the more sensitive test?
Not necessarily. I mean, as we've mentioned, the quantitation is not perfect on that instrument, and I did not design this technique to precisely quantitate how much EDTA was present, or if it wasn't present. I was trying to determine whether it was there or not from preserved blood. So twice as much would not make that much of a difference in the results that I got.
Did you run any experiments with different amounts? Well, let me rephrase that. Would you agree that in order to make any kind of an assessment of concentration of how much you get at the end of the process, you have to know how much you start with?
Sure, yes.
Now, the evidence that you received, let's talk about the back gate first. That was in the form of what?
It was blood that was